You're not unfocused. You're leaking yourself. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't feel like a collapse. It happens quietly. In small moments, you barely question. You wake up, and before your feet even touch the floor, your hand is already reaching for your phone. Notifications, messages, news, someone else's opinion about something that has nothing to do with your life. Within seconds, your mind is no longer yours. It's scattered across other people's priorities, and that's just the beginning. Throughout the day, your attention gets pulled in every direction. A message interrupts your work. A notification breaks your concentration. A conversation drags you into something you didn't plan to care about. You try to focus, but your mind feels fragmented, like you're constantly starting over. You're busy, but you're not moving forward. And deep down, you feel it. The frustration, the lack of clarity, the sense that you should be further ahead, more in control, more focused. So you tell yourself you need more discipline, more motivation, more structure. But that's not the real problem. You don't lack discipline. You lack containment. Because every time you check something that doesn't matter, every time you react instead of choosing, every time you let the outside world dictate your next move, you give away a piece of your attention. And attention is power. The Stoics understood this long before the modern world turned distraction into a lifestyle. They knew that a man loses control of his life the moment he loses control of his mind. And that's the truth most people never face. You don't lack control. You've been giving it away. The real problem isn't distraction. It's addiction. Not to your phone. Not to social media. To reaction. Every notification gives you a small hit, a signal, a pull. Something happened. Someone said something. Something needs your attention right now. And in that moment, reacting feels like control. You check the message. You reply quickly. You engage. And for a second, it feels like you're on top of things. But you're not. You're being led. Because every time you react instantly, you reinforce a pattern. Stimulus appears, and you answer without thinking. Over time, that pattern becomes automatic. You stop choosing your actions. You start defaulting to them. This is the loop most people never see. Something happens, you react. Another thing happens, you react again, and again, and again, until your entire day becomes a chain of responses to things you didn't choose. You wake up reacting. You work reacting. You communicate reacting. And at the end of the day, you feel exhausted without knowing why. Because reaction feels active, but it's passive. It creates the illusion of control while quietly removing it. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that the more you allow external events to dictate your internal state, the less ownership you have over your life. You become dependent on what happens next, on what someone says, on what appears on your screen, on what goes wrong. Instead of directing your life, you wait for it to move you. And that's the truth most people avoid. You're not living your life. You're responding to it. Habit 1. Silence stops energy leaks. Most men don't realize how much energy they lose just by talking. Not just casual conversation, but unnecessary expression. Every time you announce your plans before you've acted on them, you release pressure that was supposed to drive execution. You feel a sense of progress without actually making any. Your brain rewards you for talking, and that reward weakens your need to do the work. So you speak. You explain your goals. You share your intentions. You tell people what you're about to become. And slowly, Without noticing, your action starts to fade, because part of you already feels like it's done something. The same thing happens when you over-explain yourself. Someone questions you, and instead of standing still, you rush to justify. You add context. You try to be understood. You try to make sure they see your reasoning. But in doing that, you give away position. You signal uncertainty. You show that you need agreement to feel grounded. The Stoics moved differently. They didn't rush to speak. They didn't rush to explain. They didn't feel the need to announce what they were building. They understood something simple but powerful. Energy that is contained becomes force. Energy that is expressed too early becomes noise. Silence is not weakness. It is control. When you stop speaking prematurely, something shifts inside you. Your attention turns inward. Your intentions stay intact. Your actions become sharper because nothing is being leaked outward. You build quietly. You move deliberately. And when you finally speak, it's not to impress. It's to confirm what you've already done. That's the shift. Stop speaking before you've built something real. Because real power doesn't talk early. It shows up later. Habit 2. Control your attention or lose your life. Your attention is your most valuable asset. Not your time. Not your energy. Your attention. Because where your attention goes, your life follows. Most men don't lose their future in a single decision. They lose it in fragments. Small, repeated moments where their focus is pulled away from what matters and handed over to things that don't. A notification here, a distraction there, a quick scroll that turns into 20 minutes. It doesn't feel serious, but it adds up. And over time, something deeper starts to break. Your identity, because when your attention is constantly divided, your mind never stays in one place long enough to build anything meaningful. You start everything, you finish nothing. You think about progress, but you rarely create it. This is what distraction really is. Not just interruption, but fragmentation. The Stoics understood that a man who cannot direct his mind cannot direct his life. So they trained their attention with discipline. Not occasionally, but daily. And this is where your shift begins. It starts in the morning, before the world gets access to you. No phone, no noise, no external input. Just a few minutes of stillness where you decide what matters today, what you will focus on, what you will ignore. Then comes your work. Not scattered effort, focused execution. You protect blocks of time where nothing interrupts you. No checking messages, no switching tasks. Just one thing. Done fully, until it's complete. At first, it feels uncomfortable, because your mind is used to chaos. But with practice, something changes. You become sharper, clearer, more controlled, and slowly, your life begins to reflect that. Because a man who can control his attention can build anything, but a man who can't will always be pulled away from the life he's trying to create. Habit 3. The power of not reacting. Most men think strength is shown in how fast they respond. It's not. It's shown in how well they don't. Because reaction is easy. It's automatic, emotional, immediate. Someone says something disrespectful, and your ego fires instantly. You feel the urge to respond, to defend, to prove something. Your body tightens, your thoughts speed up, and before you even think clearly, you react. It feels necessary, but it's not. It's conditioned. What you're feeling in that moment isn't truth. It's activation, your ego trying to protect an image, and that urgency you feel, that pressure to respond right now, it's an illusion. because almost nothing requires an immediate emotional reaction. The Stoics understood this deeply. They trained themselves to pause, not suppress emotion but delay response long enough to see clearly. That pause is power. Imagine this. Someone challenges you, subtly disrespectful, slightly dismissive. The old version of you would jump in, immediately correct them, push back, defend your position. But now, you don't react. You stay still. You observe. You let the moment breathe. And something unexpected happens. The tension dissolves. The situation loses its weight. What felt like an attack becomes small, manageable, sometimes even irrelevant. Because without your reaction, it has nothing to feed on. This is the shift. You stop being controlled by moments. You start controlling your response to them. And over time, this builds something most men never develop: emotional authority. You're no longer pulled by every comment, every tone, every situation. You choose when to engage. You choose when to stay silent. You choose what deserves your energy. And that choice changes everything. Because every reaction you don't give is power you keep. And the man who keeps his power becomes very hard to move. Habit 4, build in silence. There's a trap most men don't even realize they're caught in. It feels like progress, but it's not. It's performance. You have an idea, a goal, a new direction, and almost immediately, you feel the urge to share it, to post about it, to tell people what you're about to do. And when you do, you feel good, recognized, supported, validated. But here's what's really happening. You're spending the reward before you've done the work. Because every time you announce your intentions, your brain releases a small dose of satisfaction. It feels like movement. It feels like progress. But in reality, you've only talked, and that feeling, it reduces the pressure to actually execute. So days pass, then weeks, and the thing you once felt excited about slowly fades away. Not because you weren't capable, but because you replaced action with expression. Now compare that to a different man. He doesn't announce. He doesn't post. He doesn't talk about what he's building. He just builds, quietly, consistently, while others are explaining their plans. He's executing them, while others are seeking attention. He's creating results. And when people finally notice him, it's not because he asked to be seen. It's because the results are undeniable. This is the Stoic way. Work in private. Refine in silence. Let your actions speak. Because silence does something noise never can. It protects your energy. It keeps your focus intact. It removes the need for external validation and replaces it with internal drive. And over time, that creates something powerful. Momentum. Real momentum. Not built on attention, but on execution. Because noise gets attention, but silence. Habit 5, inner authority. Most men are not lacking ability. They're lacking authority. Not authority over others, authority over themselves. Because deep down, they're still asking the world who they are. They look for signals, approval, reactions, subtle confirmations that they're on the right path. And when those signals are positive, they feel confident. When they're not, they hesitate, they adjust, they second guess. This is the trap. External validation creates internal instability. Your identity becomes dependent on feedback. Your confidence rises and falls based on how others respond to you. And without realizing it, you start shaping yourself to fit expectations that were never yours to carry. The Stoics rejected this completely. They built their identity from the inside out. They didn't need to be agreed with. They didn't need to be understood. They didn't need to be approved. They focused on one thing: alignment. Does my action match my standard? If yes, move forward. If not, correct it. That's it. No over-explaining. No defending every decision. No constant need to justify who you are. Because the man with inner authority doesn't argue for his position, he stands in it. He doesn't rush to explain himself to people who are committed to misunderstanding him. He doesn't dilute his direction just to be accepted. He acts, and his actions create clarity. This is where self-respect is built. Not from words, from consistency, from doing what you said you would do, especially when no one is watching, from holding your standards even when it's inconvenient, from choosing your path without needing applause. And something changes when you reach that point. You stop asking the world who you are, and the moment you stop asking, you become dangerous. Because now, your direction is yours, unshaken, unapologetic, unmovable. The man who owns his mind. At some point, something shifts. Not outside. Inside, you stop chasing clarity and you start living it. You wake up, and your mind isn't scattered anymore. There's no rush to check your phone. No urge to absorb the world before you've even grounded yourself. You sit in silence for a moment, and that silence doesn't feel empty. It feels like control. Throughout your day, you move differently. You're not pulled into every conversation. You're not reacting to every situation. You're not explaining yourself to people who don't matter. You choose what deserves your attention. And everything else, you let it pass. At work, you focus, not in bursts, not in fragments, but deeply. You finish what you start. You say less. But when you speak, people listen, not because you're louder, but because your words carry weight. In your relationships, you're present, fully there, not distracted, not half engaged. And that presence changes how people respond to you. They trust you more. They respect you more. Not because you asked for it, but because you've become someone who doesn't need to. This is the shift from reactive to sovereign. You're no longer at the mercy of the world. You're not controlled by notifications, opinion, or emotions that come and go. You own your mind. And because you own your mind, you own your direction. This doesn't happen overnight. It's built, moment by moment, choice by choice, silence by silence. So here's your move. For the next 7 days, focus inward. Say less. React slower. Build quietly. No announcements. No noise. Just control, because you don't need more information. You don't need more motivation. You don't need more noise. You need more control.